Every time you see a bottle of whiskey, rum, or vodka labeled as spirits, you're witnessing the echo of an ancient mystical truth that has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The word alcohol itself carries within it a profound secret that connects the liquid in that bottle to the deepest mysteries of existence, consciousness, and the human soul's eternal quest for transcendence. What if I told you that the very substance millions consume daily to escape reality was originally understood by ancient mystics as a direct pathway to spiritual realms, that the term AL-Kuhul holds within it keys to understanding both the highest spiritual achievements and the most dangerous spiritual traps known to humanity? Today, we're going to uncover a truth so profound that it will forever change how you understand not just alcohol, but the very nature of consciousness itself. We're going to explore why medieval alchemists called distilled alcohol spiritus, and why that word has survived unchanged into our modern world. We're going to discover how ancient wisdom keepers understood something about the relationship between matter and spirit that modern science is only beginning to glimpse. The story begins over 1,000 years ago in the laboratories of Islamic alchemists, where the foundations of modern chemistry were being laid by scholars who understood that the physical and spiritual worlds were not separate realms, but different expressions of the same underlying reality. To understand why alcohol is called spirit, we must first journey back to 8th century Arabia, where the word AL-Kuhul was born in the workshops of Islamic alchemists. These weren't merely early chemists experimenting with crude techniques. They were sophisticated natural philosophers who understood that working with matter was inseparable from working with consciousness itself. The Arabic term al-Kuhul originally referred to any fine powder produced through processes of grinding, sublimation, or distillation. The prefix al simply means the, while kuhul comes from the root meaning to powder or to make fine. Initially, this term was most commonly applied to antimony powder, a dark metallic substance used as kohl to line the eyes. This wasn't merely cosmetic. Antimony was believed to enhance spiritual vision, allowing the wearer to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality into subtler dimensions of existence. The connection between physical sight and spiritual insight was no accident in the minds of these ancient practitioners. They understood that the same processes that could refine crude antimony into its most essential, powerful form could also refine consciousness itself. The physical act of distillation became a metaphor for spiritual purification, and eventually the word al-Kuhul came to represent the essential spirit extracted from any substance through the sacred art of distillation. When Islamic alchemists first distilled wine and other fermented substances, they were amazed to discover that they could extract what appeared to be the very essence of intoxication itself. A clear, potent liquid that carried all the consciousness-altering properties of wine but in concentrated form. They had discovered ethyl alcohol, but to them, this wasn't just a chemical compound. They had successfully isolated what they believed to be the spiritual essence of the original substance. This is where the profound connection between alcohol and spirit becomes clear. These alchemists weren't working with the crude dualistic thinking that separates matter from consciousness. They understood that every physical substance contained within it a corresponding spiritual principle, and that through the proper application of heat, pressure, and time, the same forces that transform souls through life's trials, they could extract and purify these spiritual essences. The distillation process itself was viewed as a perfect metaphor for spiritual transformation. Just as crude wine must be heated, vaporized, condensed, and collected to yield pure alcohol, the human soul must undergo trials, dissolution of ego, and refinement through spiritual practice to achieve enlightenment. The clear, potent liquid they collected wasn't just alcohol to them. It was the materialized spirit of transformation itself. When this knowledge traveled to medieval Europe through the works of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan and al-Razi, European alchemists adopted not just the techniques, but the spiritual understanding behind them. They began calling distilled alcohol spiritus, the Latin word for spirit, breath, or soul. This wasn't poetic license. It reflected their genuine belief that they had isolated the spiritual principle that animates matter. The process of distillation, when understood through the lens of ancient wisdom, reveals itself as far more than a simple chemical procedure. It becomes a profound meditation on the nature of transformation, purification, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. Consider what actually happens during distillation. A complex substance, wine for instance, is subjected to controlled heat. As the temperature rises, different components begin to separate based on their volatility. The most refined, subtle elements vaporize first, rising upward toward cooler regions where they condense back into liquid form. What emerges is a substance that contains the essential characteristics of the original material, but in purified, concentrated form. Ancient alchemists saw in this process a perfect mirror of spiritual development. The heat represented the trials and challenges of life that separate the gross from the subtle, the essential from the non-essential. The rising vapor symbolized the soul's aspiration toward higher realms of consciousness. The condensation represented the integration of spiritual insight back into practical, earthly form. But here's where the profound mystery deepens. These alchemists discovered that the substance they extracted, what we now call ethyl alcohol, had the remarkable ability to dissolve and extract the essential properties of other substances. Alcohol became the universal solvent capable of drawing out the active principles from herbs, minerals, and organic materials. In alchemical thinking, this made alcohol not just a spirit itself, but the key that could unlock the spiritual essences hidden within all matter. This is why alcohol was called aqua vitae, the water of life. It wasn't hyperbole, it reflected the genuine understanding that this substance could serve as a bridge between the material and spiritual worlds. When properly prepared and used with sacred intention, alcohol could facilitate states of consciousness that allowed direct experience of spiritual realities, usually hidden from ordinary awareness. The medieval European alchemists, inheriting this wisdom from their Islamic predecessors, developed elaborate theories about how alcohol embodied the principle of spirit within matter. They observed that alcohol was simultaneously earthy enough to be produced from grain and fruit, yet so refined that it would burn with an almost invisible flame. It could preserve organic substances indefinitely, preventing decay and corruption. It could induce states of consciousness that dissolved the ordinary boundaries of self and other, time and space. To these practitioners, alcohol represented the successful materialization of spirit itself, the philosophical goal that every alchemist sought to achieve. They had found a way to make the invisible visible, to give the intangible a tangible form. In their understanding, anyone who consumed alcohol was literally taking spirit into their body, opening themselves to direct communion with forces beyond the material plane. This explains why distilled spirits were originally used almost exclusively in religious and healing contexts. They weren't recreational beverages but sacramental substances, tools for consciousness exploration and spiritual communion. The knowledge of their preparation was carefully guarded within initiatic traditions, passed down only to those who understood both their power and their proper use. Here we encounter one of the most profound paradoxes in all of spiritual practice. The same force that can elevate consciousness to divine heights can also drag it down into the deepest spiritual darkness. The ancient masters who first distilled alcohol understood this paradox intimately, which is why they surrounded its use with elaborate safeguards, rituals, and ethical teachings. True spiritual intoxication, what mystics call divine inebriation, represents the soul's overwhelming experience of union with the infinite. In this state, the ordinary boundaries of selfhood dissolve, replaced by an expansive awareness that encompasses all existence. The individual consciousness is flooded with indescribable bliss, unconditional love, and direct knowing of ultimate truth. This is the state that Rumi describes when he writes about being drunk on the wine of love, or that Christian mystics reference when they speak of being intoxicated with divine grace. Physical alcohol can produce experiences that superficially resemble this divine state. The ego softens, inhibitions dissolve, social barriers break down, and consciousness expands beyond its ordinary confines. The drinker may feel temporary liberation from the weight of everyday concerns, a sense of connection with others, or even moments of apparent spiritual insight. However, and this is crucial to understand, physical intoxication through alcohol is ultimately a simulation of spiritual experience rather than the genuine article, where true divine intoxication elevates consciousness and leaves the individual with lasting wisdom and transformation. Alcoholic intoxication actually lowers the vibrational frequency of consciousness and often leads to regret, confusion, and spiritual depletion. The ancient masters understood that physical alcohol affects what they called the subtle body, the energetic template that underlies physical form. While moderate, ceremonial use of alcohol could temporarily open certain spiritual centers and facilitate expanded awareness. Regular consumption gradually damages these subtle mechanisms, making authentic spiritual experience increasingly difficult to achieve. This is why alcohol specifically impacts the pineal gland, which esoteric traditions identify as the physical seat of spiritual perception. Modern science confirms that alcohol disrupts melatonin production and interferes with the pineal gland's normal functioning, but ancient wisdom understood this in broader terms. Alcohol literally damages the organ through which higher spiritual perceptions are received and integrated. The tragedy of alcohol's widespread recreational use is that it represents humanity's unconscious longing for spiritual transcendence being misdirected toward a substance that ultimately blocks the very experiences it seems to promise. Every desire for a drink contains within it a grain of the soul's authentic thirst for divine communion. But instead of leading to lasting fulfillment, alcohol creates a cycle of temporary satisfaction followed by deeper emptiness, keeping the individual trapped in what Eastern traditions call samsara, the wheel of suffering driven by attachment and aversion. Understanding this paradox helps explain why mystical traditions across cultures have such complex relationships with alcohol. It's not simply forbidden or permitted, but rather understood as a powerful spiritual technology that requires tremendous wisdom and discipline to use appropriately. The same substance that can serve as a sacramental key to higher consciousness becomes a prison when used unconsciously or excessively. The historical record reveals a fascinating pattern. Every culture that discovered fermentation and distillation initially understood these substances in sacred terms, using them exclusively for religious ceremony, healing, and spiritual communion. Only gradually, as spiritual knowledge became diluted and secular perspectives dominated, did alcohol transition from sacrament to recreational drug. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer and wine were considered gifts from the gods, produced under divine supervision and consumed primarily in temple contexts. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes how consuming the food of the gods, fermented beverages, grants humans temporary access to divine consciousness, but also introduces them to mortality and suffering if misused. Egyptian temple records show that specific wines were prepared for different religious purposes, with elaborate rituals governing their production and consumption. The god Osiris was credited with teaching humanity the art of winemaking, and wine was understood as his blood, a direct connection to divine life force. However, these same records contain stern warnings about the dangers of consuming wine outside of proper ceremonial context. In ancient Greece, the cult of Dionysus centered around wine as a pathway to divine ecstasy. But this tradition included sophisticated understanding of how to approach such powerful consciousness-altering substances safely. The mysteries of Dionysus weren't wine-drinking parties, but carefully structured initiations that used wine as one tool among many for facilitating profound spiritual transformation. Early Christianity inherited this sacramental understanding. The Eucharist, the central ritual of Christian worship, uses wine as a direct symbol of divine spirit, made manifest in physical form. "This is my blood," Jesus says, offering wine to his disciples. "Drink of it, all of you." This isn't metaphorical. Within the context of ancient spiritual understanding, wine literally carried spiritual essence that could facilitate communion between human and divine consciousness. Islamic mysticism, despite its general prohibition of alcohol, developed elaborate metaphorical systems around wine and intoxication. Sufi poetry is filled with references to divine wine, mystical taverns, and sacred intoxication. These weren't veiled references to actual drinking, but sophisticated spiritual teachings that used alcohol as a symbol for the overwhelming experience of divine love. However, as these traditions spread and became popular rather than initiatic, the deeper understanding was often lost. What remained were the outer forms, the consumption of alcohol, without the inner knowledge of how to use these substances as genuine spiritual tools. Sacred wine became recreational drinking, ceremonial beer became social lubrication, and distilled spirits became instruments of escape rather than transcendence. The medieval alchemists represented one of the last traditions to maintain the original sacred understanding of alcohol. They continued to approach distillation as a spiritual as well as physical process, understanding that they were working with forces that could either elevate or degrade consciousness depending on the intention and context brought to their use. This historical pattern helps explain our modern relationship with alcohol. We've inherited the substances but lost the wisdom that once governed their use. The result is a culture that unconsciously seeks spiritual experience through alcohol but lacks the knowledge to achieve anything more than temporary escape and long-term spiritual confusion. Modern neuroscience provides fascinating confirmation of what ancient mystics understood intuitively about alcohol's effects on consciousness. When we examine how ethyl alcohol actually interacts with the brain and nervous system, we discover mechanisms that help explain both its traditional role as spirit and its potential for spiritual disruption. Alcohol primarily affects the brain by enhancing the activity of GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, while simultaneously suppressing glutamate, the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. This creates a general dampening of neural activity, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function, decision-making, and what neuroscientists call cognitive control. From a mystical perspective, this is highly significant. The prefrontal cortex is essentially the neurological seat of what spiritual traditions call the ego, or mind, the analytical, separative consciousness that maintains the boundaries between self and other, subject and object. When alcohol suppresses this region, the result is a temporary dissolution of ego boundaries, creating experiences that can resemble certain meditative states. However, alcohol also significantly impacts the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and hippocampus, which are crucial for emotional processing and memory formation. Unlike authentic meditative states, which enhance emotional intelligence and create lasting positive memories, alcohol-induced experiences often involve emotional dysregulation and memory impairment. Perhaps most importantly, for understanding alcohol's spiritual effects. Research shows that alcohol significantly disrupts the default mode network, a set of brain regions that are active during rest and introspection, and which many neuroscientists believe may be the neurological basis for self-awareness and spiritual experience. Psychedelic research has shown that substances which facilitate genuine mystical experiences tend to modulate this network in very specific ways, creating temporary dissolution of ego boundaries while maintaining or enhancing overall neural connectivity. Alcohol, by contrast, tends to suppress neural connectivity overall, creating ego dissolution through impairment rather than through the enhanced integration characteristic of authentic spiritual states. This explains why alcohol-induced experiences, while they may feel spiritually significant in the moment, rarely lead to lasting insight or transformation. The impact on the pineal gland, which ancient traditions identified as the third eye, or seat of spiritual perception, is particularly revealing. Modern research confirms that alcohol disrupts melatonin production and interferes with the pineal gland's role in regulating circadian rhythms. But esoteric physiology suggests that the pineal gland's spiritual functions extend far beyond hormone production. According to this understanding, the pineal gland serves as an interface between physical and subtle levels of consciousness, receiving and integrating information from higher dimensions of awareness. Alcohol's disruption of pineal function therefore interferes with the very mechanisms through which authentic spiritual perception occurs, explaining why regular alcohol consumption tends to diminish rather than enhance spiritual sensitivity over time. Understanding alcohol as a counterfeit spirit provides a crucial key for anyone seeking authentic spiritual development. The challenge isn't simply to avoid alcohol, but to recognize and redirect the deeper longing that often drives people toward it. The soul's genuine thirst for transcendence and divine communion. Every impulse to drink contains within it a spark of authentic spiritual desire. The person reaching for a beer after a stressful day is unconsciously seeking peace and relaxation, legitimate spiritual needs. The individual drinking wine to feel more connected at social gatherings is expressing the soul's natural desire for communion and intimacy. The person consuming spirits to escape emotional pain is responding to the genuine spiritual need for liberation from suffering. The problem isn't the desires themselves, which are natural and healthy expressions of spiritual longing. The problem is seeking to fulfill these legitimate spiritual needs through a substance that provides temporary simulation rather than genuine satisfaction. It's like being hungry and eating candy. The sugar provides temporary pleasure and energy, but it doesn't provide real nourishment and often leaves you hungrier than before. Authentic spiritual practice offers genuine fulfillment for the same longings that drive people toward alcohol. The peace sought through drinking can be found through meditation, which provides deeper and more lasting relaxation than any external substance. The social connection desired can be cultivated through genuine intimacy and community based on authentic communication rather than shared intoxication. The escape from emotional pain can be achieved through practices that transform suffering at its root rather than temporarily masking it. This is why so many genuine spiritual traditions include practices that naturally produce states resembling positive aspects of alcohol intoxication, but through entirely different mechanisms. Sufi whirling creates altered states of consciousness through rhythmic movement and breath. Hindu kirtan uses repetitive chanting and music to induce transcendent experiences. Christian contemplative prayer facilitates profound states of divine union. Buddhist meditation can produce extraordinary states of bliss and expanded awareness. The key insight is that these practices work by enhancing rather than suppressing natural spiritual capacities. Where alcohol temporarily dissolves ego boundaries through impairment, authentic spiritual practices dissolve ego boundaries through integration and expansion. Where alcohol provides temporary escape from suffering, genuine spiritual work transforms the relationship to suffering at its source. For individuals seeking to break free from dependence on alcohol, understanding this spiritual dimension often proves crucial. Programs that address only the physical and psychological aspects of alcohol dependency, while valuable, often miss the deeper spiritual hunger that drives the addictive cycle. When this spiritual dimension is acknowledged and addressed through authentic practices, recovery becomes not just abstinence from a harmful substance, but discovery of the genuine spiritual fulfillment that was being sought all along. The process requires patience and commitment, because unlike alcohol's immediate but temporary effects, authentic spiritual practices typically develop gradually over time. The person accustomed to instant alterations in consciousness through drinking must learn to appreciate the subtle but cumulative benefits of consistent spiritual practice. However, those who make this transition often report that the states of consciousness available through authentic spiritual practice far exceed anything they experienced through alcohol, with the added benefit of promoting rather than undermining overall health and well-being. The ultimate teaching hidden within alcohol's designation as spirit points toward one of the most profound spiritual truths. The force you seek through external substances already exists within you in unlimited measure. The ancient alchemists, who first distilled alcohol, understood that they weren't creating spirit. They were revealing spirit that was already present in potential form within the original substance. This same principle applies to human consciousness. The transcendent states, the divine connection, the peace and bliss that people unconsciously seek through alcohol consumption, all of these already exist within human awareness in their most pure and powerful form. Spiritual practice doesn't add anything to your consciousness. It removes the obstacles that prevent you from recognizing what was always there. Understanding alcohol as a counterfeit spirit becomes a teaching tool for recognizing authentic spiritual experience. Just as you can distinguish genuine currency from counterfeit money by studying the authentic version, you can learn to distinguish genuine spiritual states from artificial simulations by developing familiarity with the real thing through consistent practice. The implications extend far beyond alcohol itself. In our modern world, we're surrounded by counterfeit substitutes for authentic spiritual fulfillment, entertainment that simulates genuine joy, social media that mimics real community, consumer goods that promise but cannot deliver lasting satisfaction. The same discernment that allows you to see through alcohol's false promise of spiritual connection can help you navigate all the other seductive counterfeits that surround us. True spiritual development always involves learning to distinguish between what merely appears to satisfy our deepest longings and what actually does satisfy them. This discernment isn't developed through intellectual analysis alone, but through direct experience of authentic spiritual states that provide the standard by which all substitutes can be recognized. The word spirit itself, deriving from the Latin spiritus meaning breath, points toward the most fundamental spiritual practice available to every human being. Your breath, right now, is the direct connection between your physical body and the subtle spiritual forces that animate it. Through conscious breathing practices, you can access the same expanded states of awareness that people seek through alcohol, but in their pure, undiluted form. When you understand that the spirit you seek through external substances is actually the very essence of your own deepest being, everything changes. The search turns inward, the practices become tools for recognition rather than acquisition, and the journey becomes one of uncovering rather than obtaining. You discover that what you were seeking through alcohol, peace, connection, transcendence, bliss, has been your own essential nature all along, simply waiting to be recognized and embodied. This recognition transforms not only your relationship with alcohol, but your entire approach to spiritual seeking. You stop looking for spirit in substances and start recognizing spirit as the very foundation of your own awareness. You stop trying to get high and start learning to recognize that your natural state, properly understood, is already the highest state possible. The ancient alchemists' greatest discovery wasn't the distillation of alcohol. It was the recognition that the same transformative power they could extract from matter already existed within consciousness itself, waiting to be awakened through proper understanding and practice. This is the true spirit that alcohol can only counterfeit but never replace. The infinite, eternal, ever-present spiritual essence that you already are.